A sick Mustang stands alone in the desert, tied to a withered tree by a bitter rancher who sees no value in the dying horse. As vultures circle overhead and coyotes prowl in the shadows, the horse closes its eyes, accepting its fate. But destiny has other plans, and what happens next will transform this abandoned creature into a legend that would shake the foundations of the racing world. Stay with us for an extraordinary tale of survival, redemption, and a spirit that refused to be broken. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The merciless Nevada sun beat down on the barren landscape, casting long shadows across the desert floor as dusk approached. The air shimmered with heat, creating wavering mirages that danced across the horizon. Among the sparse vegetation and weathered rocks, a solitary figure stood beneath a gnarled juniper tree, a once magnificent Mustang, its head hanging low in defeat. The horse's coat, which might have once shone like polished copper, was now dulled by illness and neglect. Its ribs protruded sharply beneath its skin, and its muscles trembled with exhaustion. A crude rope bit into its neck, binding it to the ancient tree that offered little shelter from the scorching heat. This was Thunder's Blood, a name whispered with reverence among wild horse handlers for his legendary speed and untamable spirit, now reduced to a shadow of his former glory. Marcus Fletcher, a third-generation rancher whose dreams had turned as bitter as the alkaline dust beneath his boots, stood back to survey his handiwork. The thick rope was secure. The horse wouldn't break free this time. His weathered face twisted into a grimace as he remembered the $1,000 he'd spent on veterinary bills, trying to cure whatever illness had taken hold of the magnificent stallion he'd captured just 3 months ago. "Should have known better than to try taming the devil himself," Marcus muttered, adjusting his worn Stetson. The horse had been his last hope, a chance to prove that Fletcher Ranch could still produce champions. But Thunder's Blood had fought him every step of the way, refusing to submit, and now this mysterious illness had sealed both their fates. With the bank breathing down his neck and bills piling up, Marcus couldn't afford to keep throwing money at a dying horse. The Mustang's eyes, once fierce and proud, now gazed at Marcus with an unsettling mix of resignation and accusation. Those eyes had burned with defiance the day Marcus and his crew had found him leading a wild herd through Red Rock Canyon. They'd separated him from his family, thinking they could break his spirit and harness his incredible speed. But Thunder's Blood had other ideas. Even sick, the horse managed to lift his head slightly, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of approaching predators. The desert wasn't as empty as it appeared. Coyotes had been watching from the shadows since Marcus had first led the horse here, their yellow eyes glinting with hungry anticipation. Above, vultures wheeled in lazy circles, nature's cleanup crew preparing for their grim task. Marcus checked his watch, an old timepiece passed down from his father, its face scratched and worn like everything else in his life. The sun would set soon, and with it would come the predators. He'd chosen this spot carefully, far enough from any trails or roads that no one would stumble upon the scene. By tomorrow, there would be nothing left to find. "You cost me everything," he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Should have known better than to bet the ranch on a wild thing like you." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but he forced them out anyway, needing to justify his actions to the empty desert air. Thunder's Blood watched him with those knowing eyes, and for a moment something passed between them, an understanding. Perhaps, or maybe just the weight of what could have been. The horse had shown such promise in those first few days, before the illness took hold. His speed had been supernatural, his grace unmatched. Local traders had already been making offers, sight unseen based on reputation alone. But now As the horse stood trembling beneath the juniper tree, those dreams seemed as insubstantial as the heat mirages shimmering on the horizon. Marcus turned away, unable to bear the sight any longer. The sound of his boots crunching on the sandy soil seemed unnaturally loud in the desert stillness. A coyote's yip echoed across the landscape, answered by another, then another. They were growing bolder as the light faded. Marcus quickened his pace, heading for his truck parked behind a ridge. He didn't look back, couldn't look back, even when he heard Thunder's blood let out a soft, mournful whinny. Not a cry for help, but a farewell to the world that had dealt him such a cruel hand. As Marcus's truck roared to life and disappeared, into the gathering dusk, Thunder's blood stood alone beneath the ancient juniper. The rope around his neck felt heavier with each passing moment, but something stirred in those deep eyes. A spark that refused to die, a fire that would soon ignite a legend. The desert landscape transformed as darkness crept across the barren expanse, painting the world in deep purples and blues. The temperature plummeted rapidly, a stark contrast to the scorching heat of day. Thunder's blood stood motionless beneath the juniper tree. His copper coat turned silver in the emerging moonlight as the sounds of the desert night grew bolder around him. The ancient juniper's twisted branches cast strange shadows that danced. Across the ground, stirred by a bitter wind that carried the scent of sage and dust. The rope that bound the proud stallion had already rubbed his neck raw, but he barely seemed to notice the pain. His once powerful frame, now diminished by illness and hardship, swayed slightly with each labored breath. In the distance, the haunting chorus of coyote calls grew closer, more insistent. Their yips and howls echoed off the canyon walls, creating an eerie symphony that spoke of hunger and patience. The predators had been watching since Marcus Fletcher had first led Thunder's blood to this desolate spot, and now they were growing bolder with each passing moment. Thunder's blood's nostrils flared, drawing in the scent of the approaching danger. Despite his weakened state, generations of wild instinct coursed through his veins. His ears swiveled, tracking the movement of unseen creatures in the darkness. The desert night was alive with threat and promise, and even in his resignation, the stallion's spirit refused to be completely subdued. The first coyote emerged from behind a weathered boulder, its lean frame a testament to the harsh desert. Life. Its yellow eyes gleamed with predatory intelligence as it assessed the tied horse. Another appeared from the shadows of a dried creek bed. Then another from behind a cluster of sage. They moved with the coordinated purpose of experienced hunters, forming a loose circle around the juniper tree. Above, the vultures had settled into nearby trees for the night, their dark shapes like grotesque fruit hanging from skeletal branches. They would wait for morning, content to let the coyotes do the brutal work of bringing down their shared prey. Their patience was infinite. They had seen this scene play out countless times in the unforgiving desert. As the coyotes crept closer, Thunder's blood lifted his head higher, some shadow of his former majesty returning to his bearing. He had not survived countless seasons in the wild, led herds through drought and storm, outrun both predators and captors to die without dignity. The illness that ravaged his body had weakened his flesh, but it hadn't touched the core of what made him legendary. A larger coyote, likely the pack leader, moved forward with predatory grace. Its scarred muzzle and battle-worn ears spoke of many successful hunts. But as it approached, Thunder's blood did something unexpected. He pawed at the ground with one hoof, raising a small cloud of dust. It was a gesture of defiance, a reminder that even bound and sick, he was still a creature of pride and power. The gesture gave the coyotes pause. They were opportunistic hunters, used to taking down the weak and helpless. But there was something in the stallion's stance, in the way he held himself despite his obvious weakness, that made them hesitate. The pack leader took another step forward, testing the horse's resolve. Thunder's blood responded with a weak, but deliberate snort, tossing his head as much as the rope would allow. His eyes, though glazed with fever, held a fierce light that spoke of an unbroken spirit. The coyotes circled closer, emboldened by their numbers, yet still cautious of their unusual prey. The wind picked up, carrying with it the ancient voice of the desert, a whisper of stories written in sand and stone, of creatures that refused to submit to the harsh laws of survival. The juniper's branches creaked overhead, its centuries old, limbs witnessing yet another drama in the eternal dance of life and death beneath its twisted canopy. A young coyote, too hungry or too inexperienced to properly read the situation, darted forward with snapping jaws. Thunder's blood, despite his weakness, managed to pivot slightly, avoiding the attack. The movement sent waves of pain through his fever-racked body, but he remained standing, his legs trembling with the effort. The pack leader watched this exchange with calculating eyes, reassessing the risk versus reward of this potential meal. The horse was weak, yes, but not as helpless as it had first appeared. More coyotes began to move forward, testing the horse's defenses from different angles, looking for an opening. As the night deepened and stars blazed overhead, Thunder's blood stood his ground beneath the ancient juniper. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Each breath was a struggle, each moment a battle against the weakness that threatened to overwhelm him. But in his eyes burned something that the coyotes couldn't understand. A fire that spoke of races yet to be run, of greatness yet to be achieved. The desert held its breath, watching this strange tableau of defiance in the face of certain doom. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for the abandoned stallion. For even as the coyotes prepared for their final assault, a distant sound carried on the wind, a sound that would change everything. Through the inky darkness of the desert night, a beam of light cut across the landscape like a blade, accompanied by the distant rumble of an engine. The coyotes froze, their predatory focus disrupted by this unexpected intrusion. Thunder's blood's ears pricked forward, his nostrils flaring as he caught a new scent on the wind, the scent of hope. The light grew stronger, bouncing off the rocky terrain as a vehicle navigated the treacherous desert paths. It was a beaten-up Jeep Cherokee, its suspension groaning in protest as it crawled over the uneven ground. Behind the wheel sat Sarah Blackwood, a retired veterinarian whose love for wild horses had earned her both respect and ridicule in these parts. Sarah hadn't planned to be out here tonight. She'd been heading home from treating a neighbor's cattle, when something, intuition perhaps, or the desert spirits her Navajo grandmother had always spoken of, had urged her to take the long way home. Now, as her headlights swept across the scene before her, she understood why. The Jeep's approach sent the coyotes slinking back into the shadows, though their eyes still gleamed from the darkness, unwilling to completely abandon their prize. Sarah pulled to a stop, leaving the engine running and the headlights illuminating the extraordinary scene before her. The sight of the bound horse made her breath catch in her throat. Even in his weakened state, Thunder's blood presented a striking figure. The headlights caught his copper coat, revealing both its former glory and current deterioration. Sarah's experienced eyes took in every detail. The rope burns on his neck, the pronounced ribs, the trembling muscles, and the fever-bright eyes that still somehow managed to hold a spark of defiance. "Oh, you beautiful creature," she whispered, reaching for her medical bag. "What kind of monster would leave you out here like this?" She grabbed a flashlight and stepped out of the Jeep, moving slowly and deliberately. In her 30 years of veterinary work, she'd never seen anything quite like this. The horse watched her approach, his ears following her movement. There was intelligence in those eyes, Sarah noted, and something more, a determination that transcended his physical condition. She'd heard stories about a magnificent wild stallion that had been captured a few months ago, stories that had made their way through local ranching communities. Looking at him now, she understood why he'd become something of a legend. Sarah kept her movements slow and predictable as she drew closer, speaking in soft, soothing tones. "Easy there, boy. I'm not here to hurt you." The horse's nostrils flared, taking in her scent. Whether it was her gentle approach or some innate understanding between kindred spirits, Thunder's blood didn't shy away from her presence. The beam of her flashlight revealed more details of his condition. The illness was obvious. Elevated. Temperature, labored breathing, nasal discharge. But what caught Sarah's attention was the underlying strength still evident in his frame. This wasn't just any horse. This was an exceptional animal, fighting against tremendous odds. She reached the juniper tree and examined the rope. "Whoever did this wanted to make sure you wouldn't escape," she muttered, anger coloring her voice. The knots were tight and numerous, speaking of deliberate cruelty rather than casual neglect. Sarah retrieved a knife from her bag and began carefully cutting through the thick fibers. Thunder's blood remained still during this process, as if understanding her intentions. His eyes, though glazed with fever, followed her movements with remarkable awareness. The coyotes watched from the darkness, their disappointed yips occasionally breaking the desert silence. As the last strand of rope fell away, Sarah got her first unobstructed look at the magnificent animal before her. Despite his illness and mistreatment, there was something about him that spoke of greatness, not just what he had been, but what he could still become. Her trained eye could see past the current deterioration to the exceptional conformation beneath. "You're not done yet, are you?" she asked softly, reaching out slowly to touch his neck. To her surprise, Thunder's blood allowed the contact, his skin twitching slightly under her cool hand. The fever was high, but not dangerously so. The illness, whatever it was, hadn't broken his spirit, and Sarah suspected it wouldn't break his body either. She opened her medical bag and began a preliminary examination, speaking continuously in low, soothing tones. "Let's see what we're dealing with here, boy. Someone gave up on you too soon, but I think they're going to regret that decision." The horse stood patiently as she worked, seeming to understand that this human was different from the last. In the distance, the coyotes began to retreat, their hungry yips fading into the desert night. The vultures, too, sensing that their anticipated feast would not materialize, took wing with heavy beats, disappearing into the darkness. The ancient juniper creaked softly overhead, its twisted branches now witness to not an ending, but a beginning. Sarah Blackwood didn't know it yet, but this chance encounter in the desert night would mark the beginning of an extraordinary journey. One that would take a condemned horse from the brink of death to heights of greatness that would astound the racing world. For now, though, she focused on the immediate task of saving his life, unaware that she was helping to write the first chapter of a legend. The first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in pale lavender as Sarah's jeep carefully navigated the rough terrain back to her ranch. Thunder's blood stood unsteadily in the makeshift containment area she'd created in the back, his body swaying with each bump and turn. She'd managed to coax him into the vehicle with gentle persistence and what remained of her emergency apple supply, though the loading process had revealed just how weak the magnificent stallion had become. "Almost there, boy," Sarah called over, her shoulder, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with injured animals. The horse nickered softly in response, a sound that held more exhaustion than fear. Through her rearview mirror, she could see him fighting to maintain his balance, his proud head drooping lower with each passing mile. Willow Creek Ranch appeared. On the horizon, its weathered buildings slowly taking shape in the growing light. It wasn't a large operation, nothing like the sprawling cattle ranches that dominated this part of Nevada, but it was uniquely suited to Sarah's purpose. Over the years, she'd transformed the modest property into a sanctuary for injured and abandoned horses, though she'd never encountered a case quite like this one. As she pulled up to the barn, the property's other residents began to stir. A few curious heads poked out of stall windows, and her stable hand, Miguel Rodriguez, emerged from the bunkhouse, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His expression shifted from drowsy to alert the moment he saw what, or rather who, was in the back of the jeep. "Dios mío," Miguel breathed, approaching cautiously. "Is that who I think it is?" His eyes widened as he took in the copper. Coat and distinctive white blaze, features that had become almost mythical in local horse-handling circles. Thunder's blood? Sarah nodded grimly as she climbed out of the jeep. "Found him tied to a tree out in the desert, left for dead. Coyotes were closing in." She moved to the back of the vehicle, speaking soothingly as Thunder's blood shifted restlessly. "He's running a high fever, and there's some kind of respiratory infection. We need to get him into the quarantine stall." Miguel was already moving, gathering lead ropes and setting up the isolation area they used for sick horses. He'd worked with Sarah long enough to understand the urgency of the situation. "The Fletcher spread is only about 20 miles from here," he said as he worked. "Word was they'd captured him a few months back, but then the stories just stopped." "Well, now we know why," Sarah replied, her voice hard with controlled anger. She carefully opened the back of the jeep, giving Thunder's blood a moment to orient himself. The horse's breathing was labored, each exhale accompanied by a concerning rattle. Fletcher must have given up when he got sick, decided to cut his losses in the cruelest way possible. Together, they managed to guide Thunder's blood down the ramp and toward the barn. The stallion's steps were unsteady, but he followed Sarah's lead willingly, perhaps understanding on some level that she represented his best chance for survival. The morning light revealed the full extent of his condition, the dull coat, the rope burns, the way his once powerful muscles trembled with each step. Inside the barn, the quarantine stall waited, freshly bedded with clean straw and equipped with a water trough filled with fresh, cool water. Sarah led Thunder's blood inside, noting how he immediately lowered his head to drink. It was a good sign. Many seriously ill horses lost their desire to drink, but this one still had the will to take care of himself. "Miguel, I need you to call Dr. Chen," Sarah said as she began unpacking her medical supplies. "Tell her it's an emergency. Then bring me the broad-spectrum antibiotics from the medical cabinet and help me set up the IV stand." She ran her hands along Thunder's blood's neck, feeling the heat radiating from his skin. "We're going to need everything we've got for this one." As Miguel hurried off to make the call, Sarah continued her more thorough examination. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs and looking for any injuries she might have missed in the darkness. Thunder's blood stood quietly, occasionally turning his head to watch her work, his eyes bright with fever but still alert. "You're not just any horse, are you?" she murmured, noting the perfect conformation that was still evident despite his current state. His bone structure, muscle attachment points, the way he was built, everything about him spoke of exceptional potential. Even sick and weakened, there was an undeniable quality about him that set him apart. The morning sun now streamed through the barn windows, casting long shadows across the straw-covered floor. Outside, the regular sounds of the ranch coming to life provided a comforting backdrop. Horses nickering their morning greetings, chickens announcing the dawn, the distant bawling of cattle. But here in the quarantine stall, time seemed to stand still as Sarah fought to save the life of a horse that destiny had placed in her path. She didn't know it yet, but this morning marked the beginning of a journey that would not only transform Thunder's blood, but would shake the foundations of the racing world. For now, though, she focused on the immediate battle, keeping alive the spark of greatness that still burned in those fever-bright eyes. The next 3 days at Willow Creek Ranch became a blur of constant vigilance and desperate hope as Sarah, Miguel, and Dr. Chen fought to save Thunder's Blood's life. The quarantine stall became a battleground where modern veterinary medicine clashed with an illness that seemed determined to claim its victim. But they hadn't counted on the sheer determination of their patient, a horse whose will to live burned brighter than his fever. Dr. Jessica Chen, one of the region's most respected equine veterinarians, had arrived within hours of Miguel's call. Her initial examination had confirmed Sarah's worst fears while adding new ones. "It's a case of pneumonia," she'd explained, her face grave as she listened to the stallion's labored breathing. "Complicated by exhaustion and dehydration, the next 72 hours will be critical." They set up a round-the-clock care schedule with someone always monitoring Thunder's Blood's condition. IV fluids dripped steadily into his system, fighting the dehydration that had nearly claimed his life in the desert. Powerful antibiotics waged war against the infection in his lungs, while anti-inflammatory medications worked to bring down his dangerously high fever. Sarah spent most of her time in the stall, sleeping on a cot nearby when exhaustion forced her to rest. She talked to him constantly, her voice becoming an anchor in his fever-induced haze. "You're not alone anymore," she would tell him, bathing his hot skin with cool cloths. "We're all fighting with you now." During one particularly harrowing night, Thunder's Blood's fever spiked dangerously high. His powerful frame trembled uncontrollably, and his breathing became so labored that each breath seemed like it might be his last. Sarah stayed with him through the darkness, her hand resting on his neck, feeling the rapid thunder of his pulse beneath her fingers. "Don't you dare give up," she whispered fiercely as she administered the medications Dr. Chen had prescribed. "You didn't survive the wild capture and abandonment just to let a fever take you down." As if responding to her words, Thunder's Blood turned his head slightly, his fever-bright eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Miguel maintained the rest of the ranch operations, checking in whenever he could. He'd developed a habit of bringing fresh grass and herbs from the meadow, offering them to the sick stallion. "My grandmother always said that sometimes the land provides better medicine than any doctor," he explained to Sarah. Whether it was the herbs or just the kindness of the gesture, Thunder's Blood would always nibble at Miguel's offerings, even when he refused other food. By the 3rd day, signs of improvement began to appear. The fever started to break, and Thunder's Blood's breathing, while still labored, became less desperate. His eyes, when they opened, showed more awareness of his surroundings. Dr. Chen's visits, which had been frequent and worried, began to carry notes of cautious optimism. "He's not out of the woods yet," she warned during her evening check, "but he's fighting harder than any horse I've ever treated. There's something special about this one." She paused, running her hand along Thunder's Blood's neck. "You know, when you first called me, I thought we were probably too late. I've never been so glad to be wrong." Sarah understood exactly what Dr. Chen meant. Over her years of rehabilitating horses, she'd developed an instinct for identifying exceptional animals. But Thunder's Blood was different. It wasn't just his perfect conformation or the legends that surrounded his wild days. There was something in his eyes, in the way he carried himself even while desperately ill, that spoke of greatness. As the sun set on the 3rd day, Sarah sat on her stool in the quarantine stall, watching Thunder's Blood doze. His breathing had eased considerably, and for the first time since she'd found him, his sleep seemed peaceful rather than exhausted. The worst of the fever had broken, leaving him weak but alert. "You know," she said softly, more to herself than And to the horse, everyone thought they knew what you were worth. Fletcher saw you as a quick path to profit, and when that didn't work out, he saw you as worthless. She stood, approaching the stallion, who now lifted his head to watch her. But I think you're going to prove them all wrong. I think you're going to show the world exactly what you're capable of. Thunder's blood nickered softly, reaching out to nudge her shoulder with his nose. It was the first time he'd initiated contact, and Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. The gesture seemed to carry a message. Thank you, but also, I'm not done yet. Not by a long shot. Outside the barn, the Nevada sunset painted the sky in brilliant golds and crimsons, a fitting backdrop for what felt like a turning point. The battle wasn't over. Recovery would take time, and rebuilding. His strength would be a long journey. But as Sarah stood there, watching the magnificent stallion begin to show glimpses of his true nature, she knew they had crossed an important threshold. This wasn't just about saving a horse anymore, it was about witnessing the rebirth of a legend. The following weeks at Willow Creek Ranch marked the beginning of Thunder's blood's transformation from survivor to potential champion. As his strength gradually returned, everyone who worked with him began to witness firsthand the extraordinary qualities that had made him legendary in the wild. Each day revealed new aspects of his character, his intelligence, and his undeniable athletic ability. Sarah had developed a careful rehabilitation program designed to rebuild his strength without overtaxing his recovering body. The mornings began with gentle walks around the paddock, gradually increasing in duration as his stamina improved. She watched his every movement with a trained eye, noting how, even in his weakened state, his gait showed remarkable balance and natural collection. "Look at that stride," Dr. Chen remarked during one of her follow-up visits, watching Thunder's blood walk the perimeter of his enclosure. "The way he moves, it's textbook perfect. You don't see that kind of natural ability every day." She shook her head in amazement. Fletcher must have been blind not to see what he had, even when the horse was sick. The respiratory infection had left its mark, and Thunder's blood still occasionally coughed during exertion, but his recovery was progressing faster than anyone had expected. His copper coat began to regain its shine, and the hollow places along his flanks started to fill out as his appetite returned in full force. Miguel had taken to spending his lunch breaks near Thunder's blood's paddock, often sharing his observations with Sarah. "He watches everything," he said one afternoon, nodding toward the stallion, who was indeed studying a group of birds with intense interest. "Not like other horses, he seems to understand things on a different level." Sarah had noticed this too. Thunder's blood displayed an intelligence that went beyond normal equine behavior. He quickly learned their routines, anticipated their movements, and showed an almost uncanny ability to communicate his needs. When he wanted water, he would pick up his bucket and drop it deliberately. When he felt ready for more exercise, he would stand by the gate, watching them expectantly. But it was during one particular morning that they first glimpsed the true extent of his potential. Sarah had arrived early to find Thunder's blood unusually energetic, prancing in his paddock with renewed vigor. On impulse, she decided to let him into the larger pasture for the first time since his recovery began. "Just take it easy," she cautioned as she opened the gate, though she knew he probably understood better than she did what his body was ready for. For a moment, Thunder's blood stood at the threshold, his nostrils flaring as he took in the expanse of open space before him. Then, with a joy that was almost palpable, he exploded into motion. What followed took Sarah's breath away. Thunder's blood moved across the pasture with an athleticism that defied his recent brush with death. His strides were powerful and precise, his head carried high with natural pride. He wasn't just running. He was floating, each hoof placement perfectly timed, his whole body working in seamless harmony. "Dios mío!" Miguel had appeared beside her, drawn by the spectacle. "I've never seen anything like it." They watched in awe as Thunder's blood circled the pasture, his speed increasing with each lap. Other horses in nearby paddocks stopped to watch, as if they too recognized that they were witnessing something extraordinary. When he finally slowed to a stop, Thunder's blood showed barely any signs of exertion. His breathing, once so labored and painful, remained steady and strong. He turned to look at Sarah and Miguel, and there was something almost like a challenge in his gaze, as if to say, "This is who I really am. This is what I can do." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. She had rehabilitated many horses over the years, but this was different. This wasn't just about nursing an animal back to health anymore. This was about unleashing potential that even she hadn't fully grasped until this moment. "He's not just recovered," she said quietly to Miguel. "He's ready for more, much more." The wheels in her mind began turning, possibilities unfolding before her. With his natural ability and intelligence, Thunder's blood could be more than just another success story. He could be a revolution in the racing world. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Sarah sat in her office making phone calls. She reached out to old contacts in the racing industry, arranged for specialized training equipment, and began researching upcoming qualifying events. On her desk, she started a new folder labeled simply Thunder's Blood Racing Program. Outside, the stallion stood at his paddock fence, his outline regal against the darkening sky. He seemed to be looking toward the distant mountains, perhaps remembering his days of freedom, but there was no sadness in his stance, no longing for what was lost. Instead, there was anticipation, as if he too knew that his greatest adventures still lay ahead. The days of being underestimated, of being seen as worthless, were over. Thunder's blood had survived death itself to prove his worth, and now he would show the world exactly what kind of champion had been cast aside that night in the desert. His journey from the brink of death was just the beginning. His race to glory was about to begin. The training regimen that Sarah designed for Thunder's blood was unlike anything seen before at Willow Creek Ranch. Drawing on her years of experience and understanding of equine physiology, she created a program that would not only build his strength, but also harness his natural intelligence and apparent desire to excel. Each day brought new challenges, and each day, Thunder's blood seemed to surpass everyone's expectations. Early morning workouts began with careful warm-ups, gradually increasing in intensity as Sarah monitored his every movement. The lingering effects of his illness required special attention, but Thunder's blood showed remarkable awareness of his own limits. He would push himself hard, but never too far, displaying an intuitive understanding of the balance between effort and recovery. "He's not just following the training," Sarah explained to Dr. Chen during one of her checkups. "He's actively participating in it. Sometimes I swear he knows what I'm going to ask before I ask it." They watched as Thunder's blood executed a perfect series of transitions between gaits, his movements fluid and controlled. Even Dr. Chen, who had seen countless horses in her career, shook her head in amazement. The transformation in Thunder's blood's physique became more evident with each passing day. His muscles developed definition, his chest deepened, and his stride lengthened. The copper coat that had once been dull with illness now gleamed in the sunlight, and his eyes sparked with intelligence and determination. He was becoming what nature had always intended him to be, a perfect synthesis of power and grace. Miguel had taken to timing Thunder's blood's runs around the training track they'd set up in the back pasture. "It's incredible," he reported, one morning, showing Sarah his notebook full of carefully recorded times. "He's getting faster every day, and not just by small margins." He's shattering his previous times, and he's doing it while making it look easy. But it wasn't just his speed that set Thunder's blood apart. There was something about his running style that caught the eye of everyone who watched him. He seemed to understand the concept of pacing, of holding back, and then unleashing his full potential at precisely the right moment. It was as if he had an innate understanding of racing strategy. One morning, Sarah decided to test this theory. She set up a series of markers around the track, indicating points where she wanted Thunder's blood to change his pace. To her amazement, he picked up the concept almost immediately. After just a few demonstrations, he was executing perfect pace changes at each marker, understanding not just where to change speed, but how to transition smoothly between different gaits. "It's like he's been doing this his whole life," Sarah marveled to Miguel as they watched Thunder's blood complete another perfect training run. Most horses take months, even years, to develop this kind of racing intelligence. He's doing it in weeks. Word began to spread about the miracle horse at Willow Creek Ranch. Local trainers and horse enthusiasts would drive by, hoping to catch a glimpse of Thunder's blood in action. Some offered to buy him outright, throwing out figures that made Sarah's head spin. But she knew that Thunder's blood story wasn't about money, it was about proving something to the world. During one particularly memorable training session, Thunder's blood did something that left everyone speechless. Sarah had set up a new, more challenging course with varying terrain and multiple direction changes. Instead of requiring multiple practice runs to learn the course, Thunder's blood studied it from his position at the starting point, his ears forward and his eyes focused. When Sarah gave him the signal to begin, he ran it perfectly on the first try. "Did you see that?" Miguel asked, his voice filled with awe. He memorized the entire course just by looking at it. That's not normal horse behavior. That's something else entirely. Sarah had seen it, and it confirmed what she'd been thinking for weeks now. Thunder's blood wasn't just physically gifted. He possessed an intelligence and understanding that set him apart from any horse she'd ever worked with. He wasn't just running because he was asked to. He was running because he understood the purpose behind each exercise, each challenge. As the sun began to set on another successful training day, Sarah stood with Thunder's blood in the cooling evening air. The stallion's breathing was steady and strong, showing no signs of his former illness. He turned his head to look at her, and in his eyes she saw not just intelligence, but also trust, and something that looked remarkably like determination. "You're almost ready," she told him softly, running her hand along his neck. "Soon we'll show them all what they threw away that night in the desert." Thunder's blood nickered softly in response, as if agreeing with her assessment. The qualifying races for the regional circuit would be starting soon, and Sarah knew it. It was time to take the next step. In her office that evening, she filled out the registration forms for Thunder's blood's first official race. As she wrote, she could hear him moving about in his paddock, his hoofbeats steady and strong against the earth. The horse that had been left for dead was about to embark on the next phase of his journey, and Sarah knew in her heart that this was just the beginning of something extraordinary. The morning of Thunder's blood's first qualifying race dawned clear and crisp. The Nevada sky, a perfect azure canvas, stretched over the Sierra Valley racecourse. Sarah stood at the entrance to the temporary stall they'd been assigned, watching her charge with a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. The stallion seemed to sense the importance of the day, standing alert with his ears pricked forward, taking in the unfamiliar sights and sounds of the bustling racetrack. News of the miracle horse had spread through the racing community, drawing more attention than usual to what would typically be a routine qualifying event. Trainers, owners, and curious spectators gathered near Thunder's blood stall, trying to catch a glimpse of the stallion that had reportedly risen from death's door to become a potential racing sensation. "Look at that conformation," Sarah overheard one veteran trainer whisper to another. Hard to believe someone left him for dead. The other trainer nodded, his expert eyes assessing Thunder's Blood's muscular frame and proud bearing. "Fletcher must be kicking himself right about now," he replied. "Word is he's been drinking heavily since news got out about the horse's recovery." Miguel arrived with the racing tack, his movements careful and deliberate as he began preparing Thunder's Blood for his first race. The stallion stood perfectly still during the process, his intelligence evident in the way he cooperated with each adjustment. When Miguel placed the racing saddle on his back, Thunder's Blood seemed to straighten even more, as if understanding that this was what all their training had been leading to. "He knows," Miguel said softly to Sarah. "Look at him, he understands exactly what's happening today." Indeed, there was an unmistakable energy about Thunder's Blood, a contained excitement that manifested in the subtle quivering of his muscles and the bright alertness in his eyes. This wasn't the nervous energy of a green racing horse. This was the focused anticipation of an athlete ready to prove himself. Dr. Chen arrived shortly before the race, having promised to be there for Thunder's Blood's debut. Her final check confirmed what they already knew. The stallion was in perfect health, showing no lingering effects from his near-fatal illness. "It's remarkable," she said, listening to his strong, steady heartbeat. "If I hadn't treated him myself, I'd never believe he was at death's door just months ago." As the time for the race approached, Sarah led Thunder's Blood toward the track. The other horses in the qualifying heat were younger, specifically bred and trained for racing from birth. Their handlers cast curious and somewhat dismissive glances at the older stallion with the unknown breeding. Sarah could almost hear their thoughts. What was this mysterious horse doing in a proper race? The jockey Sarah had chosen, Tommy Martinez, waited by the track. He was young but experienced, known for his gentle handling of horses and his intuitive understanding of their rhythms. Sarah had specifically selected him after watching him work with other horses, knowing that Thunder's Blood would need a rider who could appreciate and adapt to his unique intelligence. "Remember what we discussed," Sarah told Tommy as he prepared to mount. "He's not like other horses. Don't try to control him too much. Work with him, let him show you what he can do." Tommy nodded, his eyes wide, as he took in Thunder's Blood's powerful frame and alert demeanor. The stallion turned his head to study his rider, seeming to assess him just as carefully as he was being assessed. As Thunder's Blood was led into the starting gate, a hush fell over the gathering crowd. The stallion walked in calmly, showing none of the nervous energy displayed by the younger horses around him. He stood perfectly still, his ears forward, his body coiled like a spring ready to be released. Sarah made her way to the railings, her heart pounding. All their work, all their preparation had led to this moment. She thought back to that night in the desert, finding him tied to that tree, more dead than alive. Now here he stood, about to show the world what kind of champion had been so carelessly discarded. The tension mounted as the last horse was loaded into the gates. Thunder's Blood remained perfectly still, but Sarah could see the focus in his stance, the way his muscles quivered slightly with controlled energy. This was more than just a qualifying race. This was the beginning of his redemption story, his chance to prove to the world what she had known since that first morning when she watched him fight for his life. The starter raised his flag, and time seemed to slow down. Sarah held her breath, along with everyone else watching. In these final seconds before the race began, she sent up a silent prayer, not for victory, but for Thunder's Blood to show everyone else what she already knew, that sometimes the greatest champions are the ones who have had to fight the hardest just to survive. The flag dropped, the gates burst open, and Thunder's Blood's journey from death's door to racing glory was about to take its next extraordinary turn. The sound of the starting bell shattered the morning air, and the gates burst open with a metallic clang. In that explosive moment, Thunder's blood transformed from a statue of contained energy into a magnificent blur of copper and power. His start was so explosive, so perfectly timed, that several spectators gasped audibly. This was not the beginning of a qualifying race. This was the unveiling of something extraordinary. While the other horses scrambled and jostled for position, Thunder's blood moved with an almost supernatural precision. His stride was perfect, each hoof placement calculated and purposeful. Tommy Martinez, who had ridden hundreds of horses in his career, found himself doing exactly what Sarah had advised, not trying to control the stallion, but rather becoming one with his rhythm. "My God," breathed an old trainer standing next to Sarah at the rail. "Look at that stride pattern. Have you ever seen anything like it?" Sarah couldn't respond, her throat tight with emotion as she watched Thunder's blood move into the first turn. The stallion took the curve with geometric precision, leaning into it at exactly the right angle, while other horses drifted slightly wide or fought their riders for control. By the back stretch, Thunder's blood had settled into third position, but Sarah recognized the strategy in his running. This was exactly how they had trained. Conservation of energy, careful pacing, waiting for the right moment. His ears were pricked forward, his stride smooth and powerful, showing none of the strain that was beginning to appear in the other. Horses. The crowd around the track had grown larger as word spread that something special was happening. Even people who had come to watch other races were drawn to the qualifying heat, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Thunder's blood's running style was unlike anything they had seen before. It was as if he had studied and perfected the art of racing through pure instinct. As they approached the final turn, Tommy felt a subtle change in Thunder's blood's rhythm. The stallion's muscles bunched beneath him, and without any urging from his rider, he began to accelerate. It wasn't the desperate rush of a horse being pushed to its limits, but rather the calculated move of a master strategist who knew exactly when to make his bid for victory. "He's moving!" Miguel shouted, clutching Sarah's arm. "Look at him go!" Thunder's blood had shifted into another gear entirely, eating up the ground with powerful strides that seemed to defy physics. He passed the second-place horse as if it were standing still, his copper coat gleaming in the morning sun as he set his sights on the leader. The front-runner, a highly touted young stallion from a prestigious Kentucky breeding program, began to show signs of fatigue. Its stride was shortening, its head rising slightly, subtle signs that experienced racing people recognized as weakness. In contrast, Thunder's blood looked as fresh as he had in the starting gate, his stride actually lengthening as he drew alongside the leader. What happened next would be talked about in racing circles for months to come. Instead of immediately passing the struggling leader, Thunder's blood matched his pace for several strides, as if studying his opponent. Then, with a burst of speed that drew gasps from the crowd, he simply accelerated away, making it look effortless. "It's not possible," someone in the crowd muttered. "No horse runs like that in a qualifying heat. No horse runs like that, period." But Thunder's blood was rewriting what was possible with every stride. As he crossed the finish line, he was 7 lengths ahead of the nearest competitor, and Tommy had never once reached for his crop. The official time, when it was posted, caused a commotion among the racing officials. Thunder's blood hadn't just won his qualifying heat, he had set a new track record, breaking a mark that had stood for 15 years. And he had done it, while appearing to have plenty left in reserve. Sarah made her way through the gathering crowd to where Tommy was walking Thunder's blood in a cool-down circle. The jockey's face was filled with a kind of awe as he dismounted. "Miss Blackwood," he said, shaking his head in amazement, "I've never felt anything like that. He wasn't just running, he was calculating, thinking, planning every move. It was like riding pure intelligence." Thunder's blood stood quietly as they removed his racing tack. His breathing already returned to normal. His eyes were bright and alert, scanning the admiring crowd as if aware of the sensation he had created. Several prominent trainers were already approaching Sarah, their checkbooks metaphorically in hand, but she barely heard their offers. Instead, she was looking at Thunder's blood, seeing not just the victory he had just achieved, but the journey that had brought him here. From a dying horse tied to a tree in the desert to a record-breaking phenomenon on the track. It was more than just a comeback story. It was proof that greatness couldn't be extinguished by cruelty or neglect, that the spirit of a true champion would always find a way to shine. As the morning sun climbed higher in the Nevada sky, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. Thunder's blood hadn't just qualified for racing, he had announced himself as a force that would shake the racing world to its foundations. The legend that had begun in the wild was about to write its next chapter, and no one who had witnessed today's performance would ever forget what they had seen. News of Thunder's blood's extraordinary performance spread through the racing world like wildfire. By sunset, video clips of his qualifying run had gone viral in racing circles, and Sarah's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Offers poured in from prominent owners and syndicates, each one higher than the last. But Sarah remained unmoved. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about proving something to the world. "Have you seen this?" Miguel asked the next morning, holding up his tablet to show Sarah the latest racing forum discussions. The qualifying race had sparked intense debate among racing experts. Some called it a fluke, others declared it the emergence of a phenomenon. The most interesting comments came from biomechanics experts who had analyzed the footage, frame by frame. "His stride pattern is revolutionary," one expert wrote. "The efficiency of movement, the perfect coordination. It's like watching the theoretical ideal of equine locomotion come to life." Another noted, "What we're seeing here isn't just raw speed, it's a complete reconceptualization of how a horse can move." Sarah read these analyses with quiet satisfaction, but her focus remained on Thunder's blood himself. The stallion had emerged from his first race even more confident, as if the experience had awakened something deep within him. During their morning workout, he moved with an added air of purpose, his eyes bright with intelligence and determination. Dr. Chen arrived for a post-race checkup, though it seemed almost unnecessary. Thunder's blood showed no signs of stress or fatigue from his record-breaking performance. "His recovery is remarkable," she noted, listening to his strong, steady heartbeat. "Most horses need several days to bounce back from that kind of effort. He looks ready to run again tomorrow." The next few weeks brought a whirlwind of activity to Willow Creek Ranch. Racing officials came to verify Thunder's blood's eligibility for professional competition, leading to some awkward questions about his origins. Sarah was honest about finding him near death in the desert, though she carefully avoided mentioning Fletcher's name. The officials were skeptical, but couldn't deny the evidence of their own eyes. This horse was special. Tommy Martinez became a regular visitor, working with Thunder's blood to develop their partnership further. The young jockey had turned down several lucrative offers to ride other horses, choosing instead to stick with the stallion that had given him the ride of his life. "There's something almost supernatural about him," Tommy explained to Sarah. "When I'm on his back, it's like he knows what I'm thinking before I do." One morning, as Sarah watched Thunder's blood during his workout, she noticed something remarkable. The stallion had begun incorporating elements from their training exercises into his own unique running style. He would shift his weight slightly before turns, positioning himself for maximum efficiency, showing an understanding of physics that seemed impossible for a horse. "It's like he's creating his own racing theory," Miguel observed, timing another perfect practice run. "Everything we know about traditional racing techniques, he's taking it and making it better, making it his own." The racing calendar showed their next opportunity would be the Western States Championship qualifier, a significant step up in competition. It would put Thunder's blood against some of the most promising horses in the region, many with impressive pedigrees and professional racing backgrounds. Sarah knew that many in the racing establishment were waiting for this, waiting to see if the miracle horse could compete at a higher level. Thunder's blood seemed to sense the importance of their preparation. His focus during training sessions intensified. If that was even possible, he would run the practice tracks perfectly, then stop and watch other horses training, his ears forward and eyes alert, as if studying their techniques and finding ways to improve upon them. "He's not just training his body," Sarah explained to a visiting journalist who had come to write about the rising star. "He's training his mind. Every day he shows us something new, something that makes us question everything we thought we knew about what horses are capable of." The article that appeared in the Racing Chronicle captured some of this essence, titled "The Philosophy of Speed, the Mysterious Horse, Rewriting the Rules of Racing." It described Thunder's blood as not merely an athlete, but an artist, a theorist of motion who happens to have 4 legs and a copper coat that blazes like fire in the sun. As the days counted down to the championship qualifier, Sarah spent more time just observing Thunder's blood, marveling at how far he had come from that desperate night in the desert. The rope burns on his neck had faded to almost invisible scars, but they remained a reminder of his journey from death's door to the brink of racing history. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Sarah found Thunder's blood standing at his paddock fence, gazing toward the distant horizon. His stance was regal, confident, emanating the quiet strength of one who had faced death and emerged stronger. In that moment, Sarah realized that what had started as a rescue had become something far more significant. They were about to change the very nature of horse racing itself. The Western States Championship qualifier was 2 weeks away, and with it would come Thunder's blood's chance to prove that his first race was no fluke. The racing world was waiting, some with anticipation, others with skepticism. But as Sarah watched her copper-colored champion in the gathering dusk, she knew that they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning of the Western States Championship qualifier brought an electric atmosphere to Silver Crown Raceway. The prestigious track, nestled in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, had drawn the largest crowd ever seen for a qualifying event. Word had spread far beyond regional racing circles, and everyone wanted to witness the phenomenon that was Thunder's blood. In the pre-race paddock, the difference between Thunder's blood and his competitors was striking. While other horses pranced nervously or required multiple handlers to stay controlled, he stood calmly beside Sarah, his copper coat gleaming in the morning sun. His eyes moved systematically across the track, studying every detail as if memorizing the course. "Look at that focus," whispered a Hall of Fame trainer to his assistant. "That's not normal horse behavior. He's reading the track like a seasoned professional." The assistant nodded, unable to take his eyes off Thunder's blood's powerful frame. "Hard to believe this is the same horse that was left for dead. Fletcher must be dying inside, knowing what he threw away." The competition today was fierce. The field included Blue Dynasty, a Kentucky-bred champion with 3 consecutive wins, and Storm Warrior, whose speed records in California had made him the favorite to win. Their handlers cast appraising glances at Thunder's blood, some dismissive, others worried. Tommy Martinez arrived, looking sharp in the deep burgundy and gold racing silks Sarah had chosen. As he approached Thunder's blood, the stallion turned to greet him with a gentle nicker. Their bond had grown stronger with each training session, developing into a partnership based on mutual trust and understanding. "Remember," Sarah told Tommy as he prepared to mount, "let him run his race. He understands strategy better than any horse I've ever seen." Tommy nodded, his expression serious. They both knew that today's race would be different from the qualifier. Today they were facing the elite. Dr. Chen, who had come to watch, helped Sarah make the final preparations. "His vitals are perfect," she confirmed, her hand resting on Thunder's Blood's neck. "Whatever happened to him in the desert, whatever illness nearly took him, it's like his body has completely reinvented itself. He's actually healthier than horses half his age." The call to post rang out across the track. As Sarah led Thunder's Blood toward the starting gates, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes following them. Among the spectators she spotted Miguel, who had closed down the ranch for the day so the entire staff could come to watch. He gave her a thumbs up, his face beaming with confidence. Loading into the gates was a tense process for most horses, but Thunder's Blood walked in with characteristic calm. He settled into position with the precision of a mathematician, positioning his body for the optimal start. Next to him, Blue Dynasty pawed nervously at the ground, while Storm Warrior fought his handler's attempts to guide him into position. Sarah made her way to the railings, her heart pounding but her faith unwavering. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, from that moonlit desert night to this moment. Whatever happened next, Thunder's Blood had already proven himself a miracle, but something told her that the miracle was far from over. The sun broke through a bank of clouds, illuminating the track just as the starter raised his flag. Thunder's Blood's copper coat caught the light, making him shine like a living flame in the morning sun. In that moment of suspended animation, before the start, Sarah saw his ears flick forward, his muscles coil with controlled power. The gate burst open, and Thunder's Blood exploded into motion with the same supernatural precision he had shown in his first race. But this time, the competition was ready for him. Blue Dynasty and Storm Warrior matched his initial burst of speed, creating a three-way battle for the lead as they thundered down the first straight. Tommy, true to Sarah's instructions, didn't fight for position. He let Thunder's Blood find his own rhythm, settling into third place as they approached the first turn. The stallion's stride was perfect, his hooves striking the ground in a rhythm that seemed to defy the conventional laws of physics. "Look at that efficiency of movement," gasped a racing analyst who was filming the race for a documentary. "He's expending less energy than the others, but maintaining the same speed. It's like watching a masterclass in energy conservation." As they entered the back stretch, Sarah could see Thunder's Blood's strategy unfolding. He maintained his position, but his stride showed no sign of strain, while the leaders were beginning to push harder to maintain their advantage. It was exactly what they had trained for: the patience to wait, the wisdom to know when to make their move. The crowd grew louder as they approached the final turn, sensing they were about to witness something special. Blue Dynasty still led, with Storm Warrior a half-length behind, but Thunder's Blood was running his own race, his copper coat still gleaming with barely a hint of sweat, his stride as fresh as it had been at the start. The stage was set for what would become one of the most talked-about moments in racing history. As they rounded the final turn, Thunder's Blood began to unfold the next chapter of his extraordinary story. As the horses thundered into the final turn, the crowd's roar reached a fever pitch. Blue Dynasty still held the lead, with Storm Warrior pressing hard on the outside, both horses running the race of their lives. But it was Thunder's Blood, moving with supernatural grace in third position, that drew every eye on the track. The Copper Stallion seemed to be running in a different dimension, his stride pattern defying conventional racing wisdom. Tommy Martinez felt the subtle shift beneath him, the gathering of power, the slight adjustment in muscle tension that he had come to recognize as Thunder's Blood's signal that he was ready to make his move. They had trained for this moment, but nothing could have prepared the young jockey for what happened next. As they straightened for the final stretch, Thunder's Blood seemed to tap into some mysterious reserve of energy that went beyond physical conditioning. His acceleration wasn't just fast, it was revolutionary. He didn't just run past the leaders, he flowed past them with a grace that made their powerful strides look clumsy in comparison. "Dear God," breathed the track announcer, his professional demeanor cracking with amazement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't believe what I'm seeing. Thunder's blood is moving like nothing I've witnessed in 30 years of calling races. This isn't just speed, this is something else entirely." The stallion's copper coat blazed in the sunlight as he opened up a gap that seemed to defy possibility. Blue Dynasty and Storm Warrior, both champions in their own right, were now running for second place. Their jockeys pushed hard, urging their mounts forward with everything they had, but Thunder's blood was in another class entirely. Sarah, watching from the rail, felt tears streaming down her face. This wasn't just vindication, it was transformation. The horse that had been left to die in the desert was now rewriting the very definition of what was possible on a racetrack. Each stride seemed to carry a message to those who had abandoned him. "You never knew what I could become." As they approached the finish line, Thunder's blood did something that would be analyzed and discussed for years to come. Instead of simply maintaining his lead, he appeared to find yet another gear. His stride lengthened impossibly. His rhythm shifted to something that seemed to bend the laws of physics. It wasn't just running anymore. It was like watching the theoretical perfect fusion of speed and grace come to life. "He's not just breaking the track record," shouted the racing analyst, his voice cracking with excitement. "He's shattering our understanding of what a horse can do. Look at that stride pattern. It's completely revolutionary. This is history in the making, ladies and gentlemen." Thunder's blood crossed the finish line 8 lengths ahead of Blue Dynasty, with Storm Warrior another length back in third. The time displayed on the board caused an audible gasp from the crowd. He hadn't just broken the track record, he had demolished it by nearly 3 seconds, a margin that seemed impossible at this level of competition. Tommy was crying as he brought Thunder's blood back to the winner's circle, his hands shaking on the reins. The stallion's breathing was already returning to normal, his eyes bright and alert, showing none of the exhaustion that marked the other horses. He carried himself with a dignity that seemed to acknowledge the magnitude of what he had just accomplished. "I've never felt anything like that," Tommy told the gathering press, his voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't like riding a horse. It was like being part of some force of nature. He knew exactly what he was doing every step of the way. I was just there to witness it." Dr. Chen, conducting a quick post-race examination, shook her head in amazement. "His recovery rate is off the charts," she reported. "His vital signs are already nearly back to normal. Physiologically, what he's doing should be impossible, but he's doing it anyway." The racing officials who gathered around were already talking about the implications of what they had just witnessed. This wasn't just a qualifying win. It was a paradigm shift. Thunder's blood hadn't just beaten the best horses in the region. He had shown them a new way of running, a new understanding of what was possible. Sarah stood beside her champion, in the winner's circle, one hand resting on his powerful neck. She could feel the steady beat of his heart, strong and regular, as if he had just taken a morning workout rather than rewritten racing history. Around them, cameras flashed and reporters called out questions, but Sarah's focus was entirely on Thunder's blood. The stallion turned his head to look at her, his eyes holding that same intelligent gleam she had first seen in the desert. In that moment, she knew that this was more than just a comeback story. This was the beginning of a legend, the emergence of something that would change the sport forever. The horse that had been abandoned as worthless had just proven himself priceless. As the afternoon sun bathed the track in golden light, Thunder's blood stood proudly in the winner's circle, his copper coat gleaming like fire. He had done more than win a race. He had shown the world that sometimes the greatest champions emerge from the darkest moments, that true greatness cannot be broken by cruelty or neglect. His journey from death's door to racing immortality was no longer just a dream, it was becoming reality. The aftermath of Thunder's Blood's historic performance at the Western States Championship qualifier sent shockwaves through the racing world. Within hours, major sports networks were running the footage on constant repeat, while racing analysts struggled to explain what they had witnessed. The horse that had been left for dead in the desert had not only won, he had revolutionized the very concept of what was possible on a racetrack. Back at Willow Creek Ranch, Sarah found herself fielding calls from journalists, racing syndicates, and even scientific researchers. Everyone wanted to understand the phenomenon that Thunder's Blood had become. The offers to buy him had reached astronomical figures, but Sarah refused to even discuss them. This wasn't about money, it was about something far more important. "Look at this," Miguel said one morning, showing Sarah a scientific paper that had just been published online. A team of equine biomechanics researchers had analyzed Thunder's Blood's running style frame by frame. Their conclusion was revolutionary. He had developed a completely new way of moving, one that maximized efficiency while minimizing energy expenditure. "It's as if he's solved equations that our best scientists are only now beginning to understand," one researcher wrote. "His stride pattern suggests an intuitive grasp of physics and biomechanics that shouldn't be possible in any horse, let alone one who nearly died from neglect." The publicity brought an unexpected visitor to the ranch, Marcus Fletcher himself. The rancher who had left Thunder's Blood to die appeared one morning, his truck kicking up dust as it pulled into the driveway. He looked older, more haggard, the weight of his mistake evident in his bearing. Sarah met him at the gate, her expression neutral but firm. "You're not welcome here," she said simply. Fletcher's eyes moved past her to where Thunder's Blood stood. In his paddock, the stallion's copper coat gleaming in the morning sun, the horse met his former owner's gaze steadily, showing neither fear nor anger. "I came to apologize," Fletcher said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was wrong, so wrong. I didn't see what was right in front of me." He pulled out a crumpled envelope from his jacket. "I want to make it right. Whatever price you name, I'll find a way to pay it." Sarah shook her head, a slight smile touching her lips. "He's not for sale, Mr. Fletcher. Not for any price, but I think you already knew that." She glanced at Thunder's Blood, who continued to watch them with intelligent interest. "Sometimes our biggest mistakes become someone else's miracle." Fletcher left without argument, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As his truck disappeared down the road, Sarah walked over to Thunder's Blood's paddock. The stallion greeted her with a gentle nicker, his eyes bright with understanding. "You were never meant to be his," she told him softly. "You were meant for something much bigger." The next few weeks were filled with intensive training as they prepared for the upcoming racing season. Thunder's Blood approached each session with his characteristic intelligence and determination, but now there was something more, a sense of purpose, as if he understood that he was changing the sport with every stride. Dr. Chen continued to monitor his progress, amazed by his physical development. "His cardiovascular capacity has actually increased since the qualifier," she reported during one checkup. "It's like his body is still evolving, still finding new ways to improve. I've never seen anything like it." Tommy spent more time at the ranch, working with Thunder's Blood to refine their communication even further. The young jockey had turned down offers from some of the biggest names in racing, choosing instead to stay with the horse that had changed his life. "When I'm on his back," he explained to Sarah, "it's like being part of something greater than myself. He's not just running races, he's showing us what's possible." One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Sarah found Thunder's Blood standing at his favorite spot in the paddock, gazing toward the horizon. His posture was regal, confident, the stance of a champion who knew his worth. She thought about how far they had come from that desperate night in the desert, about all the people who had underestimated or abandoned him. "You proved them all wrong," she said softly, reaching out to touch his neck. Thunder's blood turned to look at her, his eyes holding that same intelligent gleam she had first seen when he was fighting for his life. In those eyes, she saw not just the past they had overcome, but the future they were racing toward. The racing calendar showed their next major challenge, the Western States Championship itself, where Thunder's blood would face an even stronger field of competitors. But Sarah wasn't worried. They had already overcome the impossible once, transforming a death sentence into a miracle of survival and triumph. As darkness settled over the ranch, Sarah looked at her champion one last time. Thunder's blood stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, his copper coat catching the last rays of sunlight. He wasn't just a racehorse anymore. He was a symbol of resilience, a living proof that greatness could emerge from the darkest moments. The next chapter of his legend was about to begin, and the world was waiting to see what other miracles this extraordinary horse would perform. The Western States Championship dawned clear and cool, with a light breeze carrying the scent of sage across Churchill Downs West. The historic track buzzed with unprecedented energy. Advance ticket. Sales had broken all records, and the stands were packed hours before the first race. Everyone had come to see the miracle horse, the champion who had emerged from the desert to revolutionize racing. Thunder's blood stood calmly in his preparation stall, his copper coat gleaming like polished metal under the morning sun. Unlike his first races, there was no skepticism among the observers now. Racing professionals spoke in hushed tones as they passed by, their expert eyes taking in his perfect conformation and the quiet confidence he exuded. "He's not just a horse anymore," one veteran trainer remarked to his colleague. "He's become something else entirely." The colleague nodded, watching as Thunder's blood methodically surveyed his surroundings. "Look at how he studies everything. Have you ever seen a horse with that level of awareness?" Sarah and Tommy went through their pre-race routine with practiced precision. The young jockey's hands were steady as he checked every strap of the racing tack, though his eyes betrayed his excitement. This was the biggest race of his career, but his confidence in his partner never wavered. "Remember," Sarah told him quietly, "this field is different. We've got Olympic bloodlines, international champions. They're here to prove that his previous wins were flukes." Tommy nodded, but a smile played at the corners of his mouth. They both knew that Thunder's blood was far beyond having anything to prove. The competition was indeed formidable. Imperial Storm, fresh from dominating the European circuit, pawed nervously at the ground in a nearby stall. Midnight Fury, with his unbroken winning streak in New York, tossed his head restlessly. These were the finest thoroughbreds in the world, bred and trained for this moment from birth. Dr. Chen arrived for a final check, though it seemed almost ceremonial at this point. Thunder's blood's vital signs were perfect, his breathing steady and strong. "It's remarkable," she said, shaking her head in amazement. "He's actually calmer than he was before his first race. It's like he knows exactly what he's capable of now." As they made their way to the track for the pre-race parade, the crowd's roar was deafening. Thunder's blood moved with characteristic grace, his stride measured and confident. Other horses pranced and fidgeted in response to the noise, but he remained focused, his eyes taking in every detail of the track. Miguel, watching from the rails with the rest of the Willow Creek staff, felt tears in his eyes. "From death's a door to this," he said softly. "It's like a dream." Around him, thousands of spectators held their breath, knowing they were about to witness something extraordinary. The loading into the gates was a study in contrasts. While other horses required multiple handlers and significant coaxing, Thunder's blood walked in smoothly, positioning himself with mathematical precision. His copper coat caught the sunlight, making him appear to glow against the stark metal. of the starting gate. Sarah made her way to her viewing position, her heart pounding but her faith absolute. They had come so far from that moonlit desert night, from a dying horse tied to a tree, to a phenomenon that had captured the world's imagination. Whatever happened next, Thunder's blood had already proven himself a miracle. The starter raised his flag, and time seemed to slow down. In that moment of perfect stillness before the start, Thunder's blood's ears pricked forward, his muscles coiled with controlled power. The other horses stamped and shifted, but he remained perfectly still, like a copper statue coming to life. The gate burst open, and 13 of the world's finest racehorses exploded into motion. Imperial Storm took the early lead, with Midnight Fury close behind. Thunder's blood, demonstrating his trademark racing intelligence, settled into fourth position, his stride pattern already showing the efficiency that had amazed scientists. "Look at that movement," the track announcer called, his voice filled with awe. "Thunder's blood is running his own race again, folks. It's like watching poetry in motion." The crowd roared as the horses thundered past the first turn, the race beginning to take shape. Tommy, following their strategy, let Thunder's blood find his own rhythm. They had trained for this, prepared for the longest and most challenging race of their career. The stallion's breathing remained steady, his stride economical, while other horses began to show early signs of exertion. As they entered the back stretch, the real race began to unfold. Imperial Storm and Midnight Fury battled for the lead, pushing each other to unprecedented speeds. Behind them, Thunder's blood maintained his position, but Sarah could see what others might miss. He was running well within himself, waiting for the perfect moment. The crowd's roar grew louder as they approached the final turn, the anticipation building to an almost unbearable level. Thunder's blood's copper coat gleamed in the sunlight, his stride still as fresh as it had been at the start. The stage was set for what would become one of the most memorable moments in racing history. The question wasn't just whether Thunder's blood could win, it was whether he would once again show the world something it had never seen before. As they rounded the final turn, that question was about to be answered in spectacular fashion. As the horses thundered into the final turn of the Western States Championship, the world seemed to hold its breath. Imperial Storm and Midnight Fury still led the pack, their hooves pounding the track with desperate intensity, but all eyes were on the Copper Stallion, running in fourth position, moving with an otherworldly grace that made the other horses look almost ordinary in comparison. Thunder's blood's moment came as they straightened for home. Without any visible signal from Tommy, he began to move. But this wasn't just acceleration, this was transformation. His stride pattern shifted into something that defied conventional understanding of equine movement, each hoof placement precisely calculated for maximum efficiency. "Ladies and gentlemen," the track announcer's voice cracked with emotion, "Thunder's blood is making his move, and I've never seen anything like this in 40 years of calling races. This isn't just speed. This is evolution happening. Before our eyes, the Copper Stallion swept past the third-place horse as if it were standing still. His movement was fluid, almost supernatural, each stride covering more ground than should have been possible. Imperial Storm and Midnight Fury, sensing his approach, pushed harder, their jockeys urging them to find another gear. But Thunder's blood was operating on a different level entirely. He caught and passed Midnight Fury with a burst of speed that drew gasps from the crowd. Imperial Storm, the European champion, fought desperately to maintain his lead. But Thunder's blood was no longer bound by ordinary limitations of horse racing. In the final furlong, Thunder's blood did something that would be analyzed and discussed. For decades to come, his stride pattern shifted again, becoming even more efficient, more perfect. It was as if he had solved some cosmic equation of motion that other horses couldn't even comprehend. "This is impossible!" The race analyst shouted over the crowd's roar. His acceleration curve is defying physics. He's not just running, he's redefining what we thought was possible in horse racing. Thunder's Blood crossed the finish line, 7 lengths ahead of Imperial Storm, setting a new track record that experts would later say might stand for generations. But it wasn't just the margin of victory or the time that made history. It was the way he had done it, showing the world a new way of running that no one had imagined possible. As Tommy brought him back to the winner's circle, Thunder's Blood's copper coat gleamed in the afternoon sun, barely darkened by sweat. His breathing was already returning to normal, his eyes bright and alert, showing none of the exhaustion that marked the other horses. Sarah made her way through the cheering crowd, tears streaming down her face. This wasn't just a victory, it was vindication. The horse that had been left to die in the desert had just won one of the most prestigious races in the world, and he had done it by showing everyone a better way. Dr. Chen, conducting the post-race examination, could only shake her head in amazement. His vital signs are already stabilizing, she reported. It's as if he's found a way to run that doesn't deplete his energy the way normal running does. He's not just winning races, he's revolutionizing our understanding of what's possible. In the days that followed, Thunder's Blood's performance became the subject of scientific studies and endless analysis. Biomechanics experts studied the footage frame by frame, trying to understand how he had achieved what should have been impossible. But the numbers and data couldn't fully explain the miracle they had witnessed. Sarah knew the truth was simpler and more profound. Standing with Thunder's Blood in his stall that evening, she remembered the dying horse she had found tied to a tree in the desert. "You never gave up," she whispered, stroking his neck. "Even when everyone else had given up on you, you knew what you could become." Thunder's Blood turned to look at her, his eyes holding that same intelligent gleam she had first seen on that moonlit night. In those eyes, she saw not just the triumph they had achieved, but all the possibilities that still lay ahead. This wasn't the end of his story, it was just the beginning. As the sun set on the greatest day in racing history, Thunder's Blood stood at his favorite spot in the paddock, his copper coat painted gold by the fading light. He had done more than win a championship. He had shown the world that sometimes the greatest champions emerge from the darkest moments, that true greatness cannot be broken by cruelty or neglect. From a dying horse in the desert to a legend that had changed racing forever, Thunder's Blood's journey was a testament to the indomitable spirit that refuses to be defeated. His story would be told for generations to come, inspiring others to believe in miracles and the power of second chances. And somewhere in the desert, an old juniper tree still stood, no longer a symbol of death and abandonment, but a marker of where one of racing's greatest legends began his extraordinary journey from darkness to light, from despair to glory, from death's door to immortality. The story of Thunder's Blood would live forever in racing history, not just as a tale of triumph, but as proof that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin in the darkest moments, and that true greatness can emerge from the most unlikely places. His legacy would inspire generations to come, reminding them that within every defeat lies the seed of an even greater victory. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.